Mm-hmm. Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. And our topic for tonight is the Peter G. Peterson Foundation's Austerity Terrorism, and the solution to that kind of terrorism. So, I don't see anyone here yet. I know there are two people watching, most probably on Twitter. But since I have a lot to do tonight, I'm going to just get right into it. I'm going to share the screen with a recent piece from the P.G. Peterson Foundation newsletter. It's called CBO's New Report Shows Worsening Fiscal Outlook. Now, this is a frequent headline at the P.G. Peterson Foundation because that's what they do. They terrorize us over the fiscal outlook. What do they mean by the fiscal outlook? Well, what they mean is their projections of the size of the national debt and the level of the debt to GDP ratio. And of course, they talk a lot about our deficits. And so this is the main vehicle for their terrorism. Today, the Congressional Budget Office updated its budget and economic projections. CBO generally does that in like January timeframe and the June timeframe. Why? Because their projections from June have to be updated. I'm sorry, their projections from January have to be updated in June because the January projections are already outdated. Anyway, the projections are emphasizing a fact that we've known for some time. The United States is on an unsustainable fiscal course marked by rising deficits. Now, I'm not sure what they mean by that, and they don't really say, but let's go a little further and see if we can infer it from what they're talking about. A key part of the challenging outlook is that rising debt and higher interest rates have pushed up interest payments, which threatens to crowd out other priorities. But why does rising interest rates, rising debts and interest rates, why does pushing up the instant payments crowd out other priorities? Well, of course, the tacit assumption here is that there's only a limited amount of money the government can spend. So if it's spending a lot on interest rates, if it's spending a lot on interest payments caused by higher interest rates, it cannot afford to spend, on other things. And the next sentence is, and it's critical that we act soon because the Social Security and Medicare trust funds will both be depleted within a decade or shortly thereafter, which would result in automatic cuts to beneficiaries and in payments to healthcare providers. Well, that's true unless we act to change our current law. But it's not true because the federal government is necessarily running out of money. Okay, because those trust funds don't contain any money. They're just an accounting record. That accounting record may, after a period of time, fall to zero, but that doesn't mean that there isn't money that could be made available to pay Social Security benefits and Medicare benefits. But going on, below are some key takeaways from the report. National debt is expected to exceed its record high in just 3 years. Now, here they don't mean in absolute terms. In other words, it's always exceeding its record high in absolute terms. What they're talking about is the debt held by the public was 97% of gross domestic product, GDP, at the end of fiscal year 2023. However, by 2027, the structural mismatch between spending and revenues, along with higher interest payments, will cause federal debt to rise above the nation's all-time high. No, not its all-time high, but its all-time high given as a percent of GDP. And the nation's all-time high of 106.1%, which was reached just after World War II, CBO projects that debt will continue rising, reaching 122% of GDP by 2034. You might ask, so what? What's wrong with that? Well, and here they have a nice graph that shows, according to the projections, it's going to rise to 122% in 2034. Well, I have ways to stop that, but it's going to rise. Let's say just going to rise to 122% in 2034. So what's wrong with that? Going on, CBO projects that the annual budget deficit will rise over the next 10 years, claiming from $1.9 trillion in 2024 to $2.9 trillion in 2034, with spending exceeding revenues by more than 1/3 in that year. Again, so what? Relative to the size of the economy, CBO projects that if current laws remain the same, the nation's budgetary shortfall will remain high over the coming years, dropping from 6.7% of GDP. Gee, it's only 6.7% of GDP. That's all the gap is. In 2024 to 5.5% in 2027. Oh, so the gap is going to get better because it gets smaller. They think smaller is better. But consider, if the gap is 6.7% of GDP, and then it's going to climb to 6.9% in percent of GDP in 2034, well, is that really bad? Because if the federal government has a deficit, that means it's putting more into the economy than it is taking out in taxation. So is it bad that it's going to climb to 6.9% in 2034? Maybe we need it to climb to 12% of GDP in 2034. What would be wrong with that? But Peterson says annual federal deficits will remain relatively high over the upcoming decade. So, oh look, it's only going to hit a peak. In 2033, it's going to hit a peak of, looks like about 7%. Boy, isn't that catastrophic? 7% of GDP. Short and long-term interest rates are expected to decrease by the end of the decade. To address high inflation, the Federal Reserve has increased the federal funds rate, that's the overnight rate of interest set by the Fed, to between 5.25% and 5.5%. As a result, the rate on 3-month Treasury bills rose substantially over the last 2 years. We don't know why that's a bad thing. But CBO expects that rate to remain stable at 5.2% in calendar year 2024 before eventually dropping to 2.8% in 2028. Afterwards, the short-term rate is anticipated to be steady through the remainder of the decade. CBO expects that the 10-year Treasury rate will average 4.5% this year, up from 3.0% a couple of years ago. The agency projects that such rates will fall to 3.6% by 2027 and then gradually rise to 4.1% in 2032. Is that bad? Again, we keep asking the question, what's so bad about this? CBO projects interest rates will remain elevated before decreasing by the end of the decade. So there it is again. 10-year interest rate is going up. A 3-month Treasury bill interest rate looks like it isn't going to go up. Looks like it's going to be very steady. Interest costs have spiked. Higher term, short term, and long term interest rates substantially pushed interest costs up since 2021. CBO expects that interest costs will be more than twice as high this year as they were just 3 years ago, rising from $352 billion in 2021 to $892 billion in 2024. Going forward, interest payments are projected to grow further and reach $1.7 trillion in 2034. Relative to the size of the economy, net interest reached a high of 3.2% in 1991. So it's not even going to reach the high. It's only going to be 1.7 trillion. Well, I take that back. This is as a percent. Reached a high of 3.2% in 1991. In CBO's projections, that ratio would be exceeded next year. So here are the net interest costs. And here we see that the historical high went to 3.2%. That was in 1994. And the world didn't come to an end. In fact, things fell and fell and fell. And now we're projected, even though we're down here at about 2.8, 2.9%, we're projected to go over 3.2% sometime in the near future. Social Security and Medicare are key factors in spending growth. Well, again, so odd, but driving by an aging population, rising healthcare costs, federal spending on major healthcare programs, Medicare, Medicaid, premium tax credits, and related spending, and the Children's Health Insurance Program will increase from 5.6% of GDP in 2024 to 6.8% in 2034. Spending for Social Security will rise over that period from 5.1% of GDP in 2024 to 6.0% in 2034. My God, the sky is falling. It's increasing from 6%, from 5.1% to 6.0%. It's increasing by 0.9%. Whatever are we going to do? Spending for the major healthcare programs in Social Security will continue to climb. There goes major healthcare programs. They're continuing to climb somewhat. This is federal spending as a percent of GDP. Social Security is rising from 4% to 5%. Discretionary spending is going down. Net interest is going up. Other mandatory spending is going down. So what? Again, so what? The major trust funds are expected to be depleted within the next decade or shortly thereafter. CBO projects the balance of Social Security's old age and survivors insurance, OASI trust fund, will be depleted in 2033. In addition, CBO's numbers indicate that Medicare's hospital insurance trust fund will be depleted shortly after the projection window. At the time of depletion for each trust fund, the corresponding program will be unable to pay its full obligations. The Highway Trust Fund is projected to be depleted in 2028. Well, all these trust funds, which are accounting records, are going to be depleted. But notice they're just accounting records. They don't have any money in them now. Where is the money? Well, the money is never in these trust funds. They're just accounting records. The money is in the Treasury General Account. It's always there, including the money that will be spent on Social Security and Medicare sometime in the future. And here's a graphic showing that OASI and health insurance trust funds, hospital insurance trust funds, will be depleted by 2034. Of course, the hospital insurance trust fund is practically depleted right now. In fact, okay, that's going to go down a little, but not that far between now and 2034. But it's the OASI that's going to go very close to zero, at zero in 2033. But look, it's going up a little bit in 2034, but it's going to be depleted in 2033. So what? These are accounting records. Number 7, revenues won't keep pace with the growth in outlays. Relative to the size of the economy, federal revenues are projected to dip next year from 17.2% of GDP in 2024 to 17.0% in 2012. That doesn't include any new Trump tax cuts, by the way. CBO anticipates that such receipts will stabilize at nearly 18% of GDP from 2026 to 2034, which will not be sufficient to cover the growth in outlays over the period. Additionally, CBO's projections assume that certain individual income tax provisions of the 2017 tax law that is set to expire at the end of 2025 will actually expire. To the degree lawmakers extend any of these provisions, as of course Donald Trump wants to do, without offsets, our fiscal situation will be that much worse. So there we go. Federal revenues as a percent of GDP. They're going to go to a high of, what is that? It looks like it's close to 11%. And they're going to fall back. And then they're projected to flatten out at 9.7%. I don't know why they're projected to flatten out. Payroll taxes are going down a little bit. They were higher. They were over 6%. They're now going to go down to 5.9%. Corporate income taxes are going down a little. The category of other revenues is going up a little, but right now they're at 1.2%. Of GDP. The fiscal outlook has worsened over the past 4 months. In February 24, CBO projected federal deficits over the 2025 to 2034 period were total $20 trillion. In the latest report, CBO projects the cumulative deficits will total $22 trillion, $22.1 trillion over the next 10 years. 10% higher than their projections 4 months ago. So their projections 4 months ago were wrong. In 4 months, they were wrong. And it shot right up to 22.1 million, trillion, shot up by over $2 trillion. Most of the higher projected deficits results from additional appropriations provided since CBO's previous report. Much of that spending stems from supplemental funding to provide aid to Ukraine, Israel, and other countries. So what happens if the Ukraine and Israel wars are over in a few months? There goes this projection. It assumes they won't end. Additionally, deficits are projected receipts of corporate income taxes and boosted projections for certain healthcare programs. A deficit for this year will also be substantially higher as a result of actions to forgive student loans or reduce such payments. Partially offsetting those elements were a number of economic changes that increased the agency's projection, of revenues. And here we see the projection on June 2024, was much higher than the projection in February of 2024. It grew by $2 trillion. Okay, that was the projection of the deficit. Sorry, not the projection of taxation. So, legislative changes amounted to $1.6 trillion. $1.1 trillion was for technical changes. That's $2.7 trillion. And economic changes, I guess the economy got better, minus $6 trillion. So that gives us the total of $2.1 trillion. CBO's report once again shows that America's fiscal trajectory is on an unsustainable path. Why does it show that? The structural mismatch between federal spending and revenues, along with the recent rise in interest rates and therefore federal borrowing costs, will pose challenges for the federal budget or economy and the nation's future if left unaddressed. What does that mean if they're left unaddressed? Well, of course, it means that we're going to do nothing about them. That raises the issue, what could we do about them? What could we do about that growing fiscal gap? What could we do between the federal spending going up and the revenues going down? Well, if one thinks that all we can do, is to raise taxes to bring in more funds, then one's going to be very pessimistic. But if we think the government can just go about creating money to create more funds, this is very tricky. When they're talking about the spending gap, they're talking about the gap between federal spending and federal tax revenues. They're not talking about the gap between federal spending and new federal reserves that are being created by the federal government. They're sort of assuming or making you assume that the gap between spending deficits and tax revenue is the same as the gap between deficits and new reserves being created. That is not necessarily true. And if that is not necessarily true, then it follows that these deficits, these so-called cumulative deficits, are not unsustainable. They're only unsustainable if you assume that the only source of new reserves for spending comes from taxation. CBO's report once again shows America's fiscal trajectory is on an unsustainable path. The structural mismatch between federal spending and revenues, along with the recent rise in interest rates and therefore federal borrowing costs, will pose challenges for the federal budget. What if I told you they don't propose challenges for the federal budget? Or what if I asked you, what is the nature of those particular challenges? Why do I say, oops, well, feedback from somewhere. Okay, glad you're still here. I inadvertently closed things without actually ending the stream. I have an echo. I don't know where the echo is coming from. Oh, I see where it's coming from. Okay, should be gone. Nope. There are two instances of me. That is my problem. So please excuse me while I try to get rid of one of these instances. How about that? Still an echo? Yeah, still an echo. Okay, let's see. Sorry for the technical difficulty. I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of it. Now I have a problem. Okay. I still have two instances of myself, okay, in the studio. That's my problem. At this point, I don't know how to get out of it. Okay, let's see. There's still an echo, but it's not much. So let me see if we can proceed. How's that? I think that's a little better. Okay. Okay, so here we are before I get back to what I was doing. Okay, I'm going to uh, take some comments. April says, Steve says, hello, everybody. April says, hey, Joepedia, great hosting last night's debate. I hung in there just to hear your commentary. Well, thank you, April. I appreciate it. Uh, Steve and April say hello to each other. Steve says, that debate, oh my God, it was a debate for the Twilight Zone. I couldn't agree more. Andy laughed out loud. Joe, it depends on what they use the money for. Okay, I think I got rid of the echo now, but I also have a problem with my settings. So let me see what I can do about my settings. Nope. Okay. I don't know how all that happened, but I will settle down now. Okay, Robert Copeland says, Joe, it depends on what they use the money for. Is giving money to Israel bad, but spending money on the Green New Deal and fixing the bridges is good? Of course, Robert, that's true. Steve, Biden was the crypt keeper, Donald the insane asylum escapee. I guess Bobby made the most sense, but I can't stand listening to him. Joe, do you ever get tired of the monetary doomsday misinformation? I'm tired all the time. I've been trying to fight against this doomsday misinformation since 2009. Robert Copeland says, I wouldn't vote for Biden, Trump, or Kennedy. Well, that's fine, Robert. There's Jill Stein to vote for. There's Cornel West to vote for. There's Claudia de la Cruz to vote for. There are the Libertarians to vote for. Steve says, Doc, who will replace Joe Biden? And I say, uh, if I had to give my best guess, okay, I say the Democrats will replace him with Gavin Newsom. That's my best guess. I believe that Gavin Newsom can beat Donald Trump. And he says, yes, no echo. Currently, add your Patreon banner. I had the echo because I had two instances of StreamYard open. I don't know quite how that happened, but it's gone now. What's the buzz about the debate? But today, haven't had a debate. There's all kinds of buzz It's too much to summarize. There are people defending Biden, making excuses for him. Evidently, he got on the road today and he made a speech somewhere, I don't know where, but he was evidently much more vigorous and much more decisive. And so people are saying, oh, that was just a fluke and this and that. Okay. But there's a lot of increasingly serious talk about replacing him and having a brokered convention. We even had some talk in this building. One of our people who reads The Guardian here was talking about who's likely to be nominated in a brokered convention. So I think Gavin Newsom will, because Gavin Newsom can raise the most money. What's this? Okay, because Gavin Newsom can raise the most money. So there was some people mentioned in an article, okay, in The Guardian. There were 6 people mentioned. Most prominent of them were Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer. And very little was said about any of the others. So that's the situation that we have at this point. There's just a lot of talk going around. Whether it'll settle down in about a week's time or whether Biden is done, I don't know. I think it would be best for the Democratic Party if they said goodbye to Joe Biden and they went on with somebody who at least would be likely to be Trump. But, I mean, this is an intolerable situation. Okay. I think Newsom is as neoliberal as anybody. And therefore, if he gets elected president, we'd be in a bad way. I don't see him necessarily ending the Ukraine war. I do see him continuously supporting Israel, no matter how crazy Israel gets. April says, oh, yeah, Gretchen, does she raise a lot of money for the corrupt DNC? Her fundraising capability is nowhere near Gavin Newsom's. On the other hand, she might be a more attractive candidate on identity policy grounds. Then the Democrats could start to hype the idea of the first woman president again. And so there are going to be some people who are going to want to do that. And what I will say for Gretchen is her term as governor showed that she's probably center left. She probably cares more for people than the conventional neoliberal politician. Many in Michigan, including those who ran against her, think that she's been a good governor for Michigan. So probably as a candidate for the people, she's more preferable, than Newsom. But Newsom can raise all sorts of California money, certainly, and money from other sectors. And he is the one who most fits the profile of the Democratic National Committee right now. So my bet is on him. The person I would like to see nominated is actually Jeff Merkley, the senator, from Oregon, who is a Bernie Sanders fellow traveler, but younger, and probably right now more capable of campaigning. Because Bernie, as you know, had a heart attack in 2020. And sure, he's over it, but whether he could stand the rigors of a campaign, even a short campaign, I don't know. But I think as a stand-in for Bernie, I think Jeff Merkley is pretty good. So let's get back to the main topic of today. Okay. Let's move to my second piece. We're way behind right now. Because I let you deviate me from my course of action. This is a piece, okay, by Ellen Brown, who every once in a while writes a really interesting piece. She was the first one to actually come up with the idea that platinum coins could be minted, or that coins could be minted to take care of the deficit, okay, in debt. The first one to actually propose platinum coin seigniorage was a guy by the name of Carlos Mucha. Carlos, writing under the handle, okay, of Beowulf, actually got part of the idea from Ellen Brown. But it was he who seized on the passage of a coin law in 1995, which gave the Secretary of the Treasury the right to order the mint to produce platinum coins with arbitrarily large face values. In other words, the Secretary was given the power to specify the face value of those platinum coins. And since the monetary value of coins has everything to do with face value and nothing to do with the material that they're printed on, that law of 1995 gives the right to the Secretary of Treasury to print a $1 trillion coin or a $100 trillion coin or a quadrillion dollar coin, and the Federal Reserve would have to take a deposit in that coin. And so, long story short, that would allow the government to create new reserves far beyond what's produced by taxation. This article by Ellen Brown is entitled "Why the Government Borrows Rather Than Prints." And she says the Greenbackers who marched on Washington in 1897 were right. We should be printing the money not for speculative ventures, but for productive endeavors. So Ellen Brown doesn't want to tell you, I don't know why, because she knows it perfectly well, but she doesn't want to tell you, she wants to use the meme of printing the money, but it's not about printing the money. Very little money is printed these days. The cash that is printed is about 3% of the total money that's out there. That's it. The rest of the money is created by banks by adding to reserves. The Federal Reserve, okay, in particular, adds to Treasury Department reserves all the time, because the fact of the matter is that tax revenue gets settled by the Federal Reserve, and in the act of settling the tax revenue, it destroys the reserves. So it has to create, therefore, new reserves to compensate for the destruction. So it creates the new reserves. Okay, the new reserves, okay, are created when tax revenue settlements are made. New reserves are created when deposits from the sale of bonds are settled. Okay, in other words, the money collected from the sale of bonds is destroyed by the Fed upon settlement, and the Fed creates new reserves that are equal to the amount of the bond revenue and places them in the Treasury spending account. Well, the Federal Reserve can also create some new reserves when a platinum coin is deposited at the Federal Reserve, because that platinum coin goes into the Federal Reserve's vault. That's an asset. And what it does then is it gives credit to the Treasury Department for the face value of the platinum coin. So that's how money gets into Treasury Department accounts through the Fed, creating new reserves. So new money is not printed. It doesn't have to be borrowed. It can just be created by the Federal Reserve with the authority given to it by Congress. How does it create the new money? It marks up the reserve accounts. It's like a spreadsheet. It marks up the spreadsheet. It marks it down when the federal government spends. It marks it up when tax revenues are settled, when deposits made for securities are settled. It marks it up. And it marks it up again when it provides coin seigniorage to the Treasury Department. And by the way, it could also mark it up if the Congress were to order the Federal Reserve to mark up the Treasury spending account by a particular amount. Anyway, going on. In the first 7 months of fiscal year 2024, net interest payments minus income on the federal debt reached $514 billion, exceeding spending on both national defense and Medicare, which until that time was $465 billion. The interest tab also exceeded all the money spent on veterans, education, transportation combined. Spending on interest is now the second largest item in the federal budget after Social Security, and the fastest growing part of the budget, on track to reach $870 billion by the end of 2024. I had read somewhere that it was on track to reach $1.2 trillion by the end of 2024. But I may be mistaken on that. She may be correct. According to the CBO, the federal deficit is $857 in the first 7 months of fiscal year 2024. In effect, the government is borrowing at interest to pay the interest on its debt, compounding the debt. For the lender, it's called the miracle of compounding interest. Interest on interest compounds exponentially. But for the debtor, it's a curse, compounding like a cancer to the point of devouring assets while growing the debt. As Daniel Ammerman, Chartered Financial Analyst, writes in an article titled, quote, "Could a compound interest wildfire threaten U.S. solvency?" unquote. The greatest debt-related threat to the solvency of the United States government, the value of the dollar, could be the fact the U.S. isn't actually making any net principal or interest payments on its debt. Well, actually, it is making net principal or interest payments on its debt. The Treasury Department is paying those interest payments to somebody. This article is compounded as wildfire threatened U.S. solvency. So he's a chartered financial analyst. That doesn't mean he knows anything about how federal money is created or spent. He may think he does, but he's showing that a compound interest wildfire threatened U.S. solvency by saying, yes, it can. It's showing he knows nothing about it, because it can't threaten U.S. solvency unless Congress decides it wants to stop spending. Well, that's not going to threaten U.S. solvency either. It's just going to make things very uncomfortable for the rest of us. The greatest debt-related threat to the solvency of the United States government, the value of the dollar, could be the fact the U.S. isn't actually making any net principal or interest payments on his debts. Oh, yeah. Net principal. Yeah. When he's saying net principal, he means that what the U.S. government is doing is borrowing more money to make the interest payments, so the net principal is going up. So that's what he means. So he is correct there. Even as it borrows to roll over the principal payments, even as it borrows still more to fund the general spending, which is in excess of taxes collected. This creates the risk of a confounding acceleration of interest payments on that debt. In other words, the U.S. is effectively insolvent, absent some major changes, which is explicitly why we need to anticipate that there will be major changes. Now, it doesn't mean it's effectively insolvent. Why not? Because Mr. Chartered Financial Analyst is not taking into account the capacity of the federal government to create as much money as it likes, as much money as it needs, as much money to pay the interest on the debt as it needs, as much money to pay the debt that falls due as it needs. How do we know this? Because that power is given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And also because the Platinum Coin Law gives the power to the executive branch to create as much money as the executive branch wants to create. Of course, the executive branch can't spend that money unless Congress has appropriated money. But the point is, it can create that money in the Treasury spending account with the help of the Federal Reserve, which will take on platinum coins and give credit to those coins and take the coin seigniorage, take the face value of the coins and put it into the public enterprise account. And from there, the Treasury Department can sweep that account for the coin seigniorage, which is the profit from the coins. That's the difference between the face value and the cost of producing a platinum coin and bringing it up to the Federal Reserve for deposit. So the Committee for a Responsible Budget, it's the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, actually, is what it is, the CRFB, and that's another debt terrorism organization that has been supported by the Peterson Foundation for a number of years. And quote, without reforms to reduce the debt and interest costs will keep rising, crowd out spending on other priorities, and burden future generations. Yeah, that's all that the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget always says. It's what the Peterson Foundation always says. Ellen Brown is saying here, in fact, we are that future generations. The chickens have come home to roost. According to the U.S. debt clock, the debt is now $34.8 trillion. Now, the MMTers have famously said, you're looking at the debt clock the wrong way around, because what the national debt is, the national debt is equal to the net private savings that have yet to be taxed back by the federal government. And MMT says you have to look at both sides of the ledger. The federal debt is somebody else's asset. Those $34.8 trillion are $34.8 trillion in net financial assets the federal government has put into the private sector. Yeah, that's the other side of the ledger going on. We would need to tax everyone at a rate of 40% without deductions to balance the budgets of our federal and local governments. An obvious non-starter. Reforms are necessary, but of what sort? Now, I don't know that reforms are necessary at all. I'll go into this a while later. But the basic point is, why do we have to balance our federal budgets? Why do we ever have to balance the budget? What's forcing us to balance the budget? Why is balancing the budget good? If we balanced the federal budget, let's say created a surplus, then the federal government would be taking out of the economy more in taxes than what it would be putting in. Why is that good? Why do we need to have that happen? We would only need to have that happen if we had trade surpluses. So we were getting money from other nations in trade. Then we might worry about the inflation being produced by those deficits. But generally speaking, having balanced budgets are not good for us. The last time we had balanced budgets in the 4 latter years of the Clinton administration, those balanced budgets kicked off a recession in the period 2000 to 2002. So, why does the government borrow its currency? The question was asked of economist Martin Armstrong, who responded. The theory was that if you borrowed rather than printed money, you were not increasing the existing money supply, and therefore, in theory, it would not be inflationary. And our friend Ellen Brown says that would be true if the debt were paid back. But today, the government doesn't repay the debt, but just keeps rolling it over, paying off old bonds as they come due with new bonds currently at higher interest rates. That's not why. That's not why, if you borrow rather than print, you would not be increasing the existing money supply. Because if you borrow, what you get is still a net financial asset that is left uh, 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 in the economy. Yes, if you deficit spend to the tune of $1 trillion and you get that money by selling Treasury securities, then you're spending the $1 trillion into the economy, but you've also taken out $1 trillion, from the economy. So strictly speaking, the money supply is not increased. But notice this. Those federal securities can be leveraged in such a way that the private sector can borrow much more than the $1 trillion itself from banks, and those private commercial banks are creating new money out of thin air. So it is not necessarily the case. We don't really know whether it's more inflationary to be selling federal bonds to try to take money out of the economy, or whether it's more inflationary to simply create, the new money. I don't like to say print the money because they don't print it anymore. They create the reserves. They mark up the spreadsheets. So the real question is whether, if you borrowed rather than marked up the spreadsheets, you were not increasing the existing money supply, and therefore, in theory, it would not be inflationary. That's more like what happens. But that theory is not necessarily true, because the net financial assets created in the economy are the same. They're just in the form of the Treasury securities. And those Treasury securities can be leveraged if you borrow money from banks using those securities as collateral. So that's why actually creating the money may not be as inflationary. Going on with Armstrong, quote, we borrow, which is worse than printing because we have to pay interest on constantly rolling the debt. So this is another point where it may actually be more inflationary because we've got to pay the interest. This year we'll spend about $1 trillion on interest. See, there's the trillion. The total national debt when Reagan took office in 1981. Had we printed the money instead of borrowing, it would have been less inflationary, probably. And the capital would have created more jobs instead of investing in government debt, which has only funded the neocon's wildest dreams, which he explained as, quote, establishing military bases everywhere. It's a good point by Martin Armstrong. A report issued by the Grace Commission during the Reagan administration concluded that at that time, most federal income tax revenues went just to pay the interest on the government's burgeoning debt. A cover letter addressed to President Reagan stated that a third of all income taxes were consumed by waste and efficiency in the federal government. Another third of any taxes actually paid went to make up for the taxes not paid by tax evaders and the growing underground economy, a phenomenon that had blossomed in direct proportion to tax increases. The report concluded, with 2/3 of every one personal income tax is wasted or not collected, 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by interest on the federal debt and by federal government contributions to transfer payments. In other words, all individual income tax revenues are gone before one nickel is spent on the services which the taxpayers expect from their government. Thomas Edison observed in 1921, if our nation can issue a dollar bond, it can issue a dollar bill. The element that makes the bond good makes the bill good also. The difference between the bond and the bill is that the bond lets money brokers collect twice the amount of the bond and an additional 20%, whereas the currency pays nobody but those who contribute directly in some useful way. It is absurd to say that our country can issue 30 million in bonds and not 30 million in currency. Both are promises to pay, but one promise fattens the usurers and the other helps the people. Excellent point, of course. It is cheaper to print money outright than to borrow money at interest that is never repaid. The greenbackers who marched on Washington in 1897 were right. We should be printing the money. Again, not printing the money, we should just be creating it. Not for speculative ventures, quote, unearned income, but for productive endeavors. The greenbackers sought a return to the system in which Lincoln's government issued U.S. notes or greenbacks directly in order to avoid a crippling debt to British bankers. They were marching for the economic producers, the farmers and factory workers represented by the Scarecrow and Tin Man and the Wizard of Oz, which took its plot from that first ever march on Washington. Won't just printing the money result in hyperinflation? Not necessarily. Price inflation results from too much money chasing too few goods. When the money is used to create new goods and services, prices remain stable. This was demonstrated by the Chinese when they increased the money supply by a factor of 1,800%, 18 times in the 23 years between 1996 and 2020. The new money went toward infrastructure and other forms of productivity, increasing GDP at the same rate, and price inflation remained consistently low during that period. But hindsight is 2020. What can be done now about the ballooning federal debt and interest bill? Hypothetically, the Treasury could buy back its debt, but under our current system, this would have to be done with more debt at even high interest rate. In fact, the Treasury is doing that now, but in modest proportions and for a different purpose. Its goal is to create a liquid market in long-term Treasuries, the sort of bonds that Silicon Valley was forced to sell at a deep discount, generating insufficient funds to ward off the massive runs in its deposits in March 2023. Nearly 200 banks were found to be in similar straits and equally vulnerable to runs. However, it would be counterproductive for the Treasury to buy back major portions of its debt with more debt at higher interest, which just compound the debt and the interest burden. Alternatively, it could issue $35 trillion coins. Now, I think that's ridiculous. Why can't it just issue one $35 trillion coin or $100 trillion coin? as was originally suggested by Stephanie Kelton and as I've been advocating for now for years. The idea of minting large denomination of coins to solve economic problems was evidently first suggested by a chairman of the coinage subcommittee of the House of Representatives. I apologize. I thought it was originally suggested by Ellen Brown herself. In the early 1980s, he pointed out the government could pay off its entire debt with some billion-dollar coins, effectively just printing or coining, the money. The Constitution gives Congress the power to coin money and regulate its value, and no limit is put on the value of the coins it creates. Of course, today these would need to be trillion-dollar coins. But by the coin law of 1995, which I think she may be just about to mention, I'll go on. Yes, she is about to mention it. Legislation initiated in 1982, however, Congress chose to impose limits on the amounts and denominations of one's coin. The one exception was the platinum coin, which was a special provision allowed to be minted in any amount for commemorative purposes. Not in 1982, though. That came later. 2013, an attorney named Carlos Mucha, blogging under the pseudonym Beowulf, proposed issuing a platinum coin to capitalize on this loophole. And with the endless gridlock in Congress over the debt ceiling, got picked up by serious economists as a way to checkmate the deficit hawks. Well, got picked up by me as a way. Oh, by the way, I've still written the only full-length book on the platinum coin. It's called Fixing the Debt Without Breaking America. It's an Amazon Kindle book, and it's still the absolutely best book written about the platinum coin because it's the only book that's written about the platinum coin. Philip Deal, former head of the U.S. Mint and co-author of the platinum coin law, confirmed that the coin would be legal tender. Yes, he did. Minting trillion-dollar coins evokes images of million-mark notes filling wheelbarrows, but as economist Michael Hudson observes, every hyperinflation in history is caused by foreign debt service collapsing the exchange rate. The problem almost always has resulted from wartime foreign currency strains, not from domestic spending, says Michael. Professor Randall Ray explained that the coin would not circulate but would be deposited in the government's account at the Fed, so it could not inflate the circulating money supply. By the way, both Carlos Mucha and myself said that way before Randy Ray said that. The budget would still need congressional approval. To keep a lid on spending, Congress would just need to abide by some basic rules of economics. It could spend on goods and services up to full employment without creating price inflation, since supply and demand would rise together. After that, it would need to tax, not to fund the budget, but to shrink the circulating money supply and avoid driving up prices with excess demand. Congress would have to be cautious about what it spent because it wouldn't want to create price inflation. But as Ellen Brown said previously, Congress could have all kinds of deficit spending as long as it was for productive purposes that would absorb the new money supply that had been calculated. If issuing 35 coins worth $1 trillion each seems too radical, Treasury could just issue $1 trillion coin annually, earmarked specifically to cover the interest. Yeah, it could. It could do that. But why not do a $100 trillion coin and pay back the $35 trillion as it falls due? Why not do that? Then the debt terrorism stops for good. It stops for good because people see you paying down the debt very, very quickly. And of course, the $100 trillion coin would also cover deficits for many years. That's the way you'd create new money without taxing money away from people. A similar hybrid approach worked for the Pennsylvania colonists when they formed their first government-owned bank in the early 18th century. Other colonies were issuing, quote, colonial script, but it was easier to issue the script than to tax it back, and they typically issued too much, inflating the money supply and devaluing the currency. The Pennsylvania colonists formed a land bank and issued money as loans to the farmers at 5% interest. To cover the interest not created in the original loans, the government was able to issue paper script directly to fund its own budget. As a result, Pennsylvania became the most productive economy in the colonies. What about tapping up the Federal Reserve? Is in a position to issue money interest free, not as the bank created deposits circulating as our M2 money supply, but as the reserves needed by banks to meet interbank transfers and withdrawals. When the Fed buys federal securities, it is mandated to return the interest to the Treasury after deducting its cost. In 2011, Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul proposed dealing with a debt ceiling by simply voiding out the $1.7 trillion in federal securities then held by the Fed. As Stephen Gandel explained, Paul's solution in Time magazine, the Treasury pays interest on the securities to the Fed, which returns 90% of these payments to the Treasury. Despite this shell game of payments, the $1.7 trillion in U.S. bonds owned by the Fed is still counted towards the debt ceiling. Yes, because of the fiction that the Fed is not a part of the government. Of course it's part of the government. I mean, it says it's part of the government. If you go to the Board of Governors site, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors site, it will say it's part of the government. Paul's plan, get the Fed and the Treasury to rip up that debt. It's fake debt anyway. The Fed is legally allowed to return the debt to the Treasury, and the Fed is legally allowed to return the debt to the Treasury to be destroyed. Congressman Alan Grayson, a Democrat, also endorsed this proposal. But since June 2022, the Fed has not been buying securities, but has been selling those it already has, reducing its balance sheet in an effort to fight price inflation by shrinking the money supply through quantitative tightening. The central bank is considered, quote, independent, unquote, of Congress, but arguably Congress could revise the Federal Reserve Act to require the Fed to buy federal securities. It could, but it doesn't want to do that because that's referred to as monetizing the Fed. And nobody likes to monetize the Treasury debt, and nobody likes to monetize the debt because that somehow, it's a moral hazard, people think. Barring those alternatives, another possibility is a very small financial transaction tax. 2023 book titled The Tale of Two Economies, a New Financial Operating System for the American Economy. Wall Street veteran Scott Smith argues we're taxing the wrong things, income and physical sales. In fact, we have two economies, the material economy in which goods and services abroad are sold, and the monetary economy involving the trading of financial assets, stocks, bonds, currencies, etc. Basically, money making money without producing new goods or services. Drawing on data from the Bank for International Settlements and the Federal Reserve, Smith shows the monetary economy is hundreds of times larger than the physical economy, or some would say the real economy. The budget gap could be closed by imposing a tax of a mere 0.1% on financial transactions, while eliminating not just income taxes, but every other tax we pay today. For a financial transaction tax of 0.25%, we could fund benefits we cannot afford today that would stimulate growth in the real economy, including not just infrastructure and development, but free college, a universal basic income, and free health care for all. Smith contends we could even pay off the national debt in 10 years or less with a 0.25% FTT, financial transaction tax. Are these proposals too radical? Perhaps, but existential crises call for radical solutions. I have my own solutions, and I was going to go over those now, but it's 9:15, and I need to know whether Dee has a show tonight. I don't really know that right now, and I need to find out. So let me go here, and let me go there. Do, 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 do. Do 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 Did the wrong thing. I've got to do that thing. Let me see if Dee has a show tonight. Around the world, Twitch TV. Yeah, Dee does have a show. So I have to go and help her out, okay, at this point. So I'm going to end this particular stream here. I may come back tomorrow night. Nah, I don't know if I'll come back tomorrow. Tomorrow night is Bonnie's birthday. And we, of course, are going to go out to celebrate, okay, her birthday. Okay. Okay, so, okay, it depends upon how early we get back from celebrating. Lana says, happy birthday, Bonnie. Thank you, Lana.
Thank you.
Perhaps I'll do a stream tomorrow night. Perhaps I won't. I may do a stream on Sunday, but you'll have some advance warning. I'll give some advance warning for sure. Okay. It's possible I'll also have a stream on Monday night, but I did have two things left for tonight I wanted to go over. One was an old post of mine. It's called Permanent Cures for Debt Ceiling Crises. I wrote it in 2018, and I think it's very clearly stated, and you can see the cures for the debt ceiling crisis very well there, I think. So, I'm going to go over your comments here. I need to go over some of them. Rob Colton says, went over what? Steve, I might. Yeah, no echo. Oh, yeah, Gretchen. I don't think Governor Newsom. So April says she's probably got a war hawk like HRC. First woman with R versus W still in the breeze would be a selling point in the White House, of course. And Merkley, Bernie 2.0 would be fantastic. Yes, that would be wonderful. April says, proceed with austerity. Sorry for deviation. Well, of course, this is about fighting austerity and fighting what the Peter G. Peterson Foundation thinks. So D says, around the world, D and Friends says 841, says hello. April says, Carlos Mucha sounds like a wrestler. No, Carlos is a very good lawyer, very bright lawyer. And April says, hi, Queen D. Steve says, hi, D. Probably balancing the budget was recommended by the parliamentarian. Nope. No, balancing the budget has been recommended for years and years and years by all the so-called fiscally responsible people who don't know any economics. That's it. They don't know any economics. They've been talking balance the budget forever. I mean, the Republicans were running on balancing the budget in Roosevelt's time. By the way, Roosevelt was running on balancing the budget in 1932. Can't believe that, right? But it's true. He ran on balancing the budget. And then he wrote, mostly had deficits, fortunately, during his time, okay, as president. Mr. Clucky. April says, wait, I'm totally lost. So the federal government does borrow from itself? No, it doesn't borrow from other nations. Does not borrow from other nations, April. No. And the federal government but doesn't borrow from the Federal Reserve. That would be known as monetizing. Okay, as monetizing. But it kind of does also. It goes through very roundabout ways, the Federal Reserve does, to actually monetize, okay, the federal debt. But it's very roundabout, so they can't be accused of monetizing very easily. Lana says, happy birthday, Bonnie. April says, Joe, I apologize in advance, but I can't hang anymore. I'm dead tired right now. Happiest birthday, Barney, you little spring chicken, putting up with Mr. Clucky. Laugh out loud. I now have a new name. It's Mr. Clucky. RFKJ wants a balanced federal budget. I am so well aware of that. I criticized him for that last night in that monumentally long stream. By the way, did you see that stream, Lana? I had like almost a 4 hour stream last night. I had 147 people here. I was pretty happy with that. But the minute I start talking some austerity terrorism in the solution, people have better things to do. They'd rather listen to the nonsense of Trump and Biden and Bobby Kennedy's replies, which were very often nonsense as well. But that's the way it is. Okay, I'm going to end it here. I got a hightail over to D's. No, it was tough because of the sound, but glad you had a good show. Yeah, they were there for the whole show. I'm just before the end, it went down to 146 people. It went down by one. Then it went back up again to 147. Yeah, it was a good show. Certainly. Thank you, Lana. But I'm going to say goodnight here, and I'm going over to D's, and I encourage you all to go over to D's. Yes, it was tough because of the sound. It was very tough. Very, very tough. The quality was quite poor because of the sound. But people hung in there. I'll see you at D's. Bye. Gonna end the stream.